So tell by my American. So if at any point speaking fast, because sometimes I just get excited about this topic, you can just go like that if it becomes weird or something. Really happy to be here. My first time in Bucharest, in Romania. We usually go to Cluj. Beautiful. Both places are beautiful. So thanks for hosting me. The topic for tonight was Agile transition. What I've noticed over the past several years is I keep getting invited into larger companies to help them do a transition to Agile, and I started noticing certain patterns in how these types of engagement proceed. I'll share some of that information, and I'm very happy to take questions throughout. So I'd prefer it not be save questions until. If you have questions, please ask. Have a good discussion, right, about this topic. So please, at any point, ask whatever questions you'd like. Really just the one slide background so you know who I am. My software engineering, all of my degrees are in computer science. Typical path through companies, developer, project manager, engineering. I've run a number of smaller companies, took a couple of them public on the US NASDAQ market. Spent 2 years in the 1990s. If you're a software developer and you're old enough to remember it, I come out of the Smalltalk world. So in the late 1980s, I helped bring Smalltalk out of systems. Early market object-oriented technology tools. So I've been doing Agile since the early 2000s. At that time, I worked for a startup called Genomica. We built software for statistical genetics. Pretty much all my time out on the road with 1 or 2 companies most every week, either doing training or doing some form of Agile coaching. So I had the pleasure of being here for teaching a class earlier in the week, and next week I have 2 more classes. So I get to see a lot, so I hope you'll ask questions and maybe I can provide some insight that you might find useful, right, in the work that you're doing. So enough. Bianca was kind enough to mention I did write a book. Don't be impressed, I wrote it in English. They just translated it into 9 other languages. So native to one of those other languages, by all means. I have a copy of the English version up here if anybody wants to look at it. And if you happen to have a copy with you and you would like me to reduce the value of your book by signing it, I would be happy to do that for you. So feel free to ask. Okay, agenda. So here are the topics for tonight. Approaches to doing a transition, then move into more of an agile approach to doing transitioning. As we all know, there's a number of scaling frameworks out there. I'm sure you've encountered them. I want to position those in the context of doing a transition. Talk about the scope of the transition. Is it a single department, multiple departments, the entire company? So for this bank, for example, I say 6,000 people. That's one division of what is one of the largest banks in the United States. So we need to understand the scope of what we're talking about. Focus on an agile mindset first. I'll show you what I mean by that. What's the role of training and coaching when you're involved in a transition? I find that in almost any company that I visit, we end up having to restructure their teams to try and achieve better flow. So I'm going to explain what I mean by that. And then finally, how do you measure the transition? Or how are we doing? How would we know? To know that. Please. Yes. That's a really good question. So when I started putting all this material together, transformation, transition, adoption, And I went through all these words and I looked at it and I settled on transition here. Really, I think if you look at the case studies that are out there, you won't find a distinction. So just multiple words being used to communicate the same thing. I would have to say more recently, over the past year, the word transformation seems to become more popular than transition. So yeah, good question. Really no distinction to be made. The reason I went for I'll tell you why I went with it. Transformation makes it sound like, you know, a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, right? Some incredible transformation. And it also makes it sound like you can arrive. And as I'm about to suggest, Agile's a journey, right? It's not a state that you achieve. So that was the motivation. Other questions on any of this before we start? Excellent. Let's jump in. As I said, please, any point, ask questions. As I was just saying, I really think of Agile as a journey. It's funny when I hear people go, what will it take for us to become Agile? As if one morning you'll just wake up and say, oh, I'm Agile. That would be me, like me saying, today I have achieved flexibility. I hope I'll be a little bit more flexible every day. I don't know that I'll ever achieve flexibility. So with Agile, for me, it's all a journey. How do I become a little bit more Agile? So don't think of there as being an end state. And that's important for what I'm about to say, because a lot of companies that contact me expect me to help them put in place a plan for them to achieve agility, as if somehow there was a target state that they could get to. So think about this for a moment. In Agile, we don't believe you can get the full requirements completed up front. That's one of the fundamental tenets of Agile. You're not going to write the requirements document on the first day of the project, the worst possible knowledge you will ever have, and somehow get it correct, complete, and unchanging. Right? What this graph is showing is that your knowledge, the dashed line, increases over time, but yet we're trying to put together all these requirements as if we're doing a water. What most companies that contact me expect they're going to do with their Agile transition. All the steps they're supposed to take so that one day they will be Agile, by whatever that means. So it's the same problem. You can't do this with requirements. We're not going to do it with the Agile transformation. This is what I would argue is a very traditional way of doing a transition. You assess where you're at today. You define the target of where you want to be. You do a form of gap analysis. This is where we're at. This is where we want to be. Here's the gap between the two. And then we put in place a plan for how to bridge the gap, and then we execute the plan. So very traditional form of what I would call transition management. And so when I get an RFP, a request for proposal, from a company that wants me to help them, almost always they describe this in their RFP. Can you come out to our company, assess us, see where we're at with our process, then define the target for where we should be, then put in place a complete plan on the first day of everything we should do, and then help us execute on the plan. So when I receive one of those requests for proposals, the first thing I do is I send them this presentation to show them that you don't want what you're asking for. You think you do, but you don't. So let's take this a little further. How would we do this differently from an Agile perspective? So if you think about how much detail should we put in place in order to start transitioning, you can have a continuum of details. On this end, nothing. Just start. No, just start. Get all 6,000 people moving. Don't worry, we'll figure out all the details as we're doing it. That's not going to feel very comfortable. The other hand, complete details, everything. volumes of books written. Here's all the work you should do. Here's the exact plan you should follow to do that. So let's agree that the reality is going somewhere in between. But what I'm suggesting is more towards this end than towards that end. So I want to have some amount of detail associated with my plan to help transition a company, but I know I can't plan it all out on the first day when I have very poor information. So this is the first concept when thinking about an agile transition. You're not going to get all the details right up front, so don't try. Plus, you're going to learn every time you take a step forward, and using that learning, of course, we're agile. That means we will inspect and adapt. All right. Let me give you an example. So last year, I helped Audible do a large transition. So moved the entire company over, 600 developers, US, UK, Germany, India. We moved everybody over. The first plan was really just train IT. And we knew that you have to train more than just IT if you want to have a successful transition or transformation. You have to get the business side involved. But initially, the CIO said, let's focus on IT for now. I'm like, fine, right? You know your company better than I do. Let's start there. But we all knew we were going to have to go to Agile. So imagine if we had put together all these detailed plans up front of how we were going to move all these people over, none of which would have involved the business side. We were about a month into all of this, and the call came to me saying, we need to engage with the business now. All these plans, all these stuff would have just gotten thrown out. It would have been a waste of effort. So the good news is we didn't do it that way, right? We set up some initial plans to train, and the moment we said now we have to train business people and start coaching them, we simply adapted what we were doing to make that work. That's how agile transitions go. You don't plan them. You don't plan every step. You have an initial plan, and you're completely prepared to adapt that plan as the situation on the ground changes. You want to balance predictive upfront work with adaptive just in time. Predictive upfront is exactly that. Try to predict everything at the very beginning, write the whole plan, put the project plan up on the wall. My guess is if you do that, you're just going to dip on down to the guessing pool. You're just guessing at that point, right? You couldn't really know that. On the other hand, if you do nothing up front, try to do everything just in time, balance. You need to find the right balance between predictive upfront and company. So there's no way to predetermine that. Questions so far? Good balance, right? Yeah, so, and you'll find the right balance point for the companies that you'll work with. Right. Right. I mean, why waste a lot of time guessing when you can go do something, inspect what you did, get real feedback, and then make an adaptation based on real data? I see no value in trying to guess, right? I see value in getting started as quickly as we can. I want to do some amount of upfront planning. So that the principle in Agile is work should be helpful, just not excessive. Of course you're going to do, I mean, just like with on any Agile project. You think you did no planning, no requirements work up front? You just showed up at one and there was your backlog all ready to use? You did some work. You just didn't do all the work up front. So balance. So the whole adoption needs to be based on core Agile principles. These are the pillars of agility. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these. If you want to, at the break, this is chapter 3. I'm not going to go through all the core Agile principles, but these are the categories of Agile principles. The important point is this. They provide the foundation, meaning this is going to sound kind of circular. You use Agile to adopt Agile. Any good principles, not waterfall principles. It seems kind of silly, right? Let's use waterfall. Here's why. I mean, let me summarize it. You can think of there being two dimensions to uncertainty. Means uncertainty, ends uncertainty. Ends uncertainty is where we want to end up. Means uncertainty is how we get there. The traditional approach to doing transition says the first thing you do is reduce all the ends uncertainty. Understand exactly where you want to get to first. And then reduce all the means uncertainty. Put in place a detailed plan of exactly how you'll get there. And we've already established that that would be a foolish way to try and do this. The Agile approach is you simultaneously reduce both forms of uncertainty. It's constantly moving. Remember, it's a journey. And that journey takes twists and turns that you can't. Please. Yes. So how do you know that a particular organization or company should actually transition Agile? So what I'm going to show in a few slides is that usually by the time I get engaged with a company, convinced they want to do Agile. Now, could they be wrong? Sure. Which is your point, right? They somehow got convinced that going Agile was a great thing to do, and maybe it's not. So let me ask a question back to you all. Have you encountered a company, maybe you work for one or consulted with one, where you thought that Agile was a bad fit for them? Well, so what circumstances were there? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so large company, projects, a lot of uncertainty. Feedback starts to come in, and maybe they get stuck in a cycle, not making progress. I found, first, in my experience, the larger the project, the more likely a company is to want to do waterfall, which seems completely counterintuitive to me. Waterfall assumes total predictability, where on large things, usually uncertainty is higher, not lower. Agile is the proper tool to take out of the toolbox when you're dealing with high uncertainty because of the fast feedback loop. Right? In the presence of a great degree of uncertainty, acquiring knowledge quickly is your best friend. So I want to go down that path. So I'll tell you where I've seen it. When management itself is not committed. They're not ready, right? Because you'll hit a ceiling. Eventually it'll change. So I did a class for a company, I'll mention the name, Yahoo, about 5 years ago. By the time I got there, they were on their, I don't recall if it was their third or fourth attempt to do a major transition to Agile. And so I'm doing this class, and I go, do you know you guys have been doing for like 10 years? And the people in the room were like, that's the first we've ever heard of that. And the reason is because at that company, if you followed Yahoo's history, they kept people who came in, wiped out everything before them because that was with the old people, and now we're going to do it our way, and then they do a restart, and then a restart. So you could argue, are they really ready to do it? So it can happen. Usually when I go into companies, first, I wouldn't engage a company, so maybe my data set is a bit biased. I wouldn't engage with a company where the management wasn't engaged because I'm just concerned it would be a waste of time. Please. Common because I think many middle managers feel that their job is going to be threatened. Either by a reorganization or a restructuring of the teams, they'll end up with less people reporting to them. I can't speak for Romania, but in the US, there are many managers who believe their value is based on how many people report to them. It doesn't exist here? Okay, good, glad to hear that. So the problem, if you sit there and say, okay, we're going to adopt Agile, and it might require that people that now report to you will report to other people, yeah, it's a problem, but that's not a showstopper for me. I would still engage with a company like that because honestly, that's almost every company that I work with, that issue exists. It's when senior management's not going to support the effort. I'll give you an example of a company, Research in Motion, RIM, BlackBerry. So I got a call from them maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and they said, we want you to come to Toronto, we want you to help us move to Agile. And my comment was, there's nothing I can do for you. No, at the level that you're going to bring me in. So honestly, given I only have 7 days a year I can help companies, honestly, I'd rather just go work. Destroy BlackBerry. There was nothing I could do to help them with that. Right? It was not at my level. So, yes. In fact, that topic was so important. Called managers. Address 2 types of managers. Functional managers, the kind we're talking about. I offered up a table in that chapter that mapped here's what such managers would do in an Agile environment. And if you look at the table and feel different characteristics, I would say at least 6 of them, same. Same, right? It's like, here's what you do today, same. What you do, same. Like the big change was you don't assign tasks to your people. In a Scrum environment, people pick up tasks by virtue of being a member of a Scrum team. So managers assign people to teams, but they don't assign work to the people. They get that through sprint planning. So usually I walk them through something like that to say, look, a lot of shoot them. It's like, that's not how this works, right? And I think it's that attitude that gets them concerned. All right, so we have the core principles in place. We talked about this. Now, if I can really get the executive management on board, we'll do something like this. I'm going to show you a couple other patterns. This is just one that involves Scrum, executive team Scrum. It's exactly what you think. There's a backlog. The product, what it has is, as you can see, larger change initiatives or impediment removal activities that only executive management can do. Like for example, at one company, we needed to change how testers were going to be compensated. because they had some stupid system of compensating testers based on number of defects found. It was like the worst idea ever, right? So like, well, you're gonna have to change that. Well, who has to change that? Not the QA manager can't change that. That's like VP of HR and VP of engineering getting together. So an item goes in the backlog, and in that particular company, they ran 3-week sprints against this backlog. There was a product owner that was an executive vice president. There was an actual scrum master, and the team here was executives. And basically, they would work off that backlog. And this backlog was published, so everybody in the company could see exactly what the executive team was working on each sprint, so that they knew that real impediments that were affecting them were actually being addressed. So have your executive team run Scrum, Agile all the way down. Start at the top, bring it all the way down. And approach. You don't have to do it, but I found it useful. There's others, right? This is out of Mike Cohn's book on Succeeding with Agile, right? The idea, the enterprise transition community, right? People who want to be involved at that level, they have an improvement backlog, very similar to what we just said. And then there's individual improvement communities. People who are in the company say, we really want to make a change in this area. They come together as a community. They work off a backlog, and they get support from the executive management to be successful. By the way, I'll make these slides available online so everybody can download them. Feel free to take pictures, but I'll be messing them up by being in the middle. You could run a Kanban system, right, to manage the flow, right, of the transition. A simple Kanban system could be used here. Backlog of the transition activities that we want to perform. Engage means we're ready to engage on this activity. Execute means we're actually working on that activity. Verify, confirming that we actually completed. Did we actually change the policy for how we're going to compensate testers, right? And then done. So now we have a visualization of where we are with important issues, impediment issues, change issues, relative to our overall transition or transformation. So you probably want to do something like this. In every company that I work with, we do one of these, right? Depending on which is the best fit for that company. Please. No, fair question. How does the initial backlog get constructed? Where did these cards come from initially? And the question was, did I do it for them? Mostly no. You can be pretty certain that when you engage a company like this, they have a pretty good idea where their pain points are. And there's already a bunch of cards. I may offer suggestions to them of where I'm seeing issues that I think they should consider addressing. But the important thing for me is I don't own their transition. Because if I own it, that means they don't. And I need them to own it. It's the old analogy, right? Nobody calls their own baby ugly. No, you'll happily call someone else's child ugly. You just won't call your own child ugly. If I define the transition, it's my baby. It has every opportunity to be ugly. They own it. I simply offer suggestions to them. If they ask me a pointed question, how should we do this? I will give them very specific examples of what I've seen other companies do and why I think some will or may not work for them. I will give them real input on that, but it'll be their choice on how they do it, because then they'll have more ownership. So yeah, I'll help, but they'll come up with a list. Other questions at this point? Awesome. Let's keep going. Please. Yes. Yeah, I will act as facilitator for that. Think of me, I oftentimes, I guess the label they'll give me will be executive coach, executive agile coach maybe. Sometimes the word external is used in there, external agile coach or something. But usually it's the higher level coach. I am typically not the person that'll come in and spend 3 months on the ground with individual teams. My schedule just doesn't permit that. So I usually do the coaching at the executive level and periodically with the teams. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, in many companies, helping them Though they can understand the roles pretty quickly. I mean, how hard is it to understand product owner, scrum master, and development team, right? Filling those roles tends to be problematic. And most companies don't have a current title called product owner. It's just not a title that exists. They might have a title like product manager or program manager or something like that. So there's almost always a discussion on how do we best fill individual roles. So I will get involved at times in helping interview internal people to help them select an appropriate candidate for a role. That I'll do, right, with them. But most of the time they have a pretty good idea of who many of these people will be. And a lot of times they're right. Sometimes they're not, but most of the time they are. Please. So I'm sure that has happened, and I probably just wasn't smart enough to realize it was happening when it did. The point is, yes, they might reject what I'm saying, but my experience is it's almost exactly the opposite. This is the silly thing about being a consultant. I go in to a company. I say exactly what you've been saying for the past 6 months, and somehow I'm more credible than you are because I'm external. I'm saying exactly what you said. Do exactly what she just said. And they're like, yeah, that's a good idea, right? And you were saying the same thing, but somehow it's more credible because I said it, because they're paying me to be an external coach to come in. That's more likely what I'm going to see. But I'm sure the others happened. Well, I just probably didn't notice it as much as I should have. That is an important comment. He said, I'm not emotionally involved. I am, because I'm not emotionally involved. And the reason I am not is I have to be able to say what I feel and what I think. And if the idea is, that can get me fired, so be it. There's plenty of other companies for me to go work with. I'm not an employee. I'm a contractor, right? So if I say something because I truly believe this is the right thing for me to say, and they're like, yeah, you can leave now. My attitude is like, okay. I'll go to the next company, right, and go help them. So I have to be in that position, because if I bite my tongue because somehow I'm trying to preserve the engagement, they don't get the real value I could deliver. I have to be honest with them. And that they may not always like it. No one's really ever asked me to leave that way that I'm aware of, but maybe it shortened my stay, right? That I wouldn't have known. Okay, don't worry. I am not going through this. I just wanted to show you there are actually a lot. This took me 5 minutes on Google to put this slide together. I just said Agile transition or transformation frameworks. Boom. There you go. So, hey, if you're not sure how you want to go, choose. No, it's all laid out for you, right? The whole pattern's laid out. You're told exactly what steps to take and move through everything. I'm not saying there aren't good ideas in those, right? You might actually be able to mine some of those for pretty good ideas, but there are companies that sort of approach customers with a prepackaged, here's how you do this. And I've been trying to make the argument our whole time together, saying there is no prepackaged pattern for how you do this. What about the scaling frameworks? There's a lot of them, right? I bet you're familiar with most of those. Which one's that? Nexus. Well done. This one? Sorry, that was easy. It was right there. This one? Safe. What about that one? Dad. Nice job. Most people wouldn't get that one. Dad is out there, but I've never run into a company that's using it. What about this one? Scrum at Scale. Nicely done. The Scrum Alliance just formed a partnership with Jeff Sutherland and his company to have Scrum at Scale be part of the offerings of the Scrum Alliance. Sorry. So you have multiple scaling frameworks, because when you think about it, when companies are thinking about an Agile adoption or Agile transition, it's at scale, right? It's not like we have one team, help us transition to Agile. Okay, that'll take a couple weeks, right? It's usually larger organizations where they are worried about doing things with more than one team. And in fact, if you go further with some of these, like take SAFe for a moment. SAFe gives you a roadmap for doing transition. So here's all the training you're supposed to get, when you're supposed to get it, right? So you can sort of weave your way around this snake to get all the way down here. So if you were going to adopt SAFe, you could argue Scaled Agile as a company is actually guiding you on how you should do that. I bet there are some companies that think, awesome. No, if you're in the category of you like cookie cutter solution, there you go. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying you can go with the scaling framework, and I bet the other ones won't be far behind, providing a roadmap for how you should transition to using their scaling framework. Let me give you an example. Well, actually, a statement first, then I'll show you the example. So I work with, maybe in a given year, 3 or 4 large companies. One person, I just don't have time to do more than 3 or 4 large companies a year. And so in each of the companies that we do, we don't use one of the scaling frameworks. They might want to mine ideas of the scaling frameworks, right? So, Audible has its own Audible Agile process. I was over here doing classes for Fitbit. I do all their training and coaching. We have the Fitbit Agile framework. No, I mean, again, you might mine some of those other frameworks. Like, a lot of these frameworks do an equivalent of like program increment planning. Some call it milestone planning, but the higher level planning, multiple sprints, right? Trying to look multiple sprints down the path. Fine. So take an example. There was a paper, Heinrich Nieberg was doing some work with Lego. He published a paper on an internal Scrum Alliance site where he talked about where they ended up. And probably the most interesting comment is right there. So when Lego started to do this, they said, let's start with using SAFe as a foundation for our transition to doing Agile at scale. By the time they were done, his comment was, we probably used about 20% of the Scaled Agile framework. So that big picture you saw earlier on Scaled Agile, about 20%. My experience with that particular framework is most companies ignore the portfolio level, which I actually think is a shame. I think there's a lot of value at the portfolio level, and it's one of the biggest issues I try to address with companies when I visit them. Almost all of them focus at the program level and try and do some form of program increment planning. That's what Lego did. And team level is all about Scrum or Kanban, so if you're doing Agile already, you're already doing that level. So hard to claim that's part of SAFe, that's just standard Scrum or Kanban. So they're kind of picking and choosing. And by the way, Dean Leffingwell would tell you, that's exactly how I would expect people to use SAFe. Nothing surprising there, right? It's a large framework and you should pick and choose those pieces that best meet your needs. And that's exactly what the previous slide said. Every company designs its own unique process that is unique to their culture, as they should. So, interesting observation. That corresponds with my observations. In the 3 or 4 that I do each year, if we started with any of the scaling frameworks, I'd be surprised if it was ever more than 20% that got used. Please. Yes. Yes. So I have done work in companies that have multiple portfolios. So imagine a president of a division where there are multiple, lacking a better term, multiple product areas underneath that president, and each product area could have a portfolio associated with it. I'm using product area loosely because the biggest problem I find right now is when I try to help companies restructure, the comment is restructure around what? What is the unit of restructuring? And the obvious thing to say is, well, products. But all right, let's run a little experiment. Think about your company. And let's see how easy the following question will be for you to answer. What are your products? My experience is that most companies that I visit can't answer that question. What are your products? Is Amazon.com the product? Is the search capability on Amazon a product? Is the carting capability a product? Is the checkout facility a product? Or are those just pieces or components of a big old thing called Amazon.com? Should there be one product backlog for all of Amazon.com? I mean, search doesn't feel like a product. I mean, last time I went to Amazon, I didn't go there to buy search. I recall using search to find something I wanted to buy, but I didn't buy search. So it seems to fail the fundamental test of being a product, something a customer would pay you for. So I'll ask you again, what are your products? Right, so now you have to organize inside. So a lot of the companies I go to, one of the first things we're doing is trying to find the first and most appropriate unit for organizing, which also aligns with being the fundable unit. Trying desperately to get away from this horrible idea called a project, which in most companies is the fundable unit. Right, so we're desperately trying to move away from that. Please. Please. So in reality, what do you think? Do you think that's one product? Okay. Right, so AWS is certainly going to be, its own thing. But just focus on Amazon.com, though. I mean, I have no idea how many people are in engineering at Amazon. I work with Audible, which is a subdivision, right, of Amazon, but I don't work with Amazon. So I don't know how many people, but I'm going with a lot. Do you think a lot of people work against a single product back called Amazon.com? By the way, some people are going to say yes to that. Absolutely. One product backlog, everybody works against it. Hey, if you can pull that off, I'm all in. That's the basic rule. No, the basic rule is one product backlog, one product owner. Absolutely. I'm just asking you, what are your products? Chances are search is treated like a product even though it's not a product. It'll be treated as a product area. So you'll treat it for all practical purposes like it were a product even though it fails the basic test of being a product. Meaning you don't buy it, right? Or a service that you would pay like AWS to get access to. So my point being, coming all the way back up to the top, when you move in to do a fundamental transition, this is one of the first questions you're going to be saddled with trying to answer. What is the unit around which we will organize our efforts? Is it a value stream, product, a capability? I could give you 10 more words that you might choose to use. Please. So I actually have a slide on that, but let me address it quickly here. That is the pilot project idea, right? That's the idea of maybe I should dip my toes into the water first before I jump in. Honestly, I think that's probably a good idea for most companies. Meaning that's how you get the bigger, higher level buy-in. Because you have a proof point, an example of that it will actually work in our company. Most companies do that, by the way. I can only think of one example offhand, a company that went all in. When they said, we're doing it, everybody's going to do it. And that company is Salesforce.com. When they decided they were going to do Agile, their CEO said, all in, either everybody's doing it or we're not doing it at all. Please. So I would say that some of them have turned out to be much less successful than we wanted it to be for any number of reasons, right? No, they're not all raging successes. I wish they were, right? And maybe it was my fault, or maybe it was variables that I couldn't control. But yeah, they're not all raging successes. The real test of any transition to me is a couple years in, how are things going? Because you're past the honeymoon period at that point, right? You can start to see reality has set in. You'll see whether it's working or not. As I said, at Amazon, like every few years, it's a restart or something. I can't speak to now. It's been 4 or 5 years since I've been there to do a class. Maybe they're doing great. So, like in the case of, well, in a lot of the companies I work with, I'll do some initial training. I'll help with the initial steps of transformation, and then usually I come back in periodically. So, for example, the class I did over here is like a quarterly class that I do. There's enough new employees that the company brings me back in, and I train the new employees, usually customized, right, to their process. It's a Scrum class, but when we talk about specific examples, it's specifically about how they do it based on their Agile approach. So that's my long term with companies. Although some companies, I might just go in and do the training, and they're like, yeah, we got it. And maybe they do, right? And you know, some of those I may not know about because I may not be back in there again. Oh, I'm sorry. Last second. It's the measurement part. Yeah, I'll definitely come to that. Other questions, please? Oh, I think he hit his hand up first. We'll come forward. Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for defining my best dream. Yeah, I mean, that's like my dream come true, right? You know, if I get called into the CEO's office saying, here's our CFO and here's our COO, and it's like, awesome. Now we can really affect some real change. No, I love that, right? I'm going to show you, well, heck, right now, scope of transition. Please. Yep. The section after this one. No, thank you, right? So earlier I mentioned one thing. By the time I get engaged in a company, I'm assuming they've already pretty much decided they're going to do Agile. I like never get a call like, can you come in and convince my management we should do Agile? I'm like, really? I just maybe it happens. I just don't get those calls. Usually by the time I get an email or a phone call, it's like they're already doing Agile and now they decided they want to do it larger. That's usually when I get called in because they understand what the benefits. I rarely have to go sell anybody on what the benefits are. They're already there. Yes, absolutely. Right? They have their initial ideas of why they want to do this. Sometimes it's just Agile for the sake of Agile. That one scares me. Why do you want to be Agile? Because Agile is the right thing to be. Why though? What are you going to get? What are the benefits, right, that you would get? So usually though, most companies have a pretty good idea of where their pain is and what they're hoping that moving to Agile will give them. So again, it'd be weird for me to go into a company and try to convince them that Agile was a good idea. By the time I show up, for whatever reason, they're already there. What I'm trying to do is help them figure out how to get to where they want to be. I hope you agree with that. Say you do, right? If you can't do a small-scale Agile, you have no hope of ever doing large-scale Agile. So I would get very concerned about a call from a company that said, you know, we are a traditional waterfall house and we got like 1,000 people and we want to move everybody over to Agile tomorrow. I'm like, maybe we should do that pilot project and dip our toes in the water first. I mean, because you haven't proven you can do it with one team and now you want to do it across the whole company? That seems very risky. So let's agree that you should probably prove that you can do it in the small before you try to do it in the large. So this was the point about the pilots, right, that I was referring to, that they are typically, by the time I show up, they're already doing Agile. They've already had some teams doing it. I think the last 4 big companies I've worked with, they already had some teams doing Agile. Initially, I probably got called in because they wanted to retrain them maybe to do Agile better somehow. But then they realized, okay, now we want more teams within the organization to do it, and we start scaling out. This is just an example of how you might go about picking an appropriate pilot project if you were one of those new companies. But what I'm saying is that's already happened by the time I get there. Oops, went too fast. Now, to this point about the COO and the CFO. As you can easily imagine, I call this the value chain. These are all the different organizations or groups within a company. I'm only showing some, right? You could probably have others. Here's my point. There's dev and IT. You can be certain that's how most companies are introducing Agile. They bring it in through the dev or IT group. It's a sensible thing to do. It's an obvious thing for them to do. So they're probably already doing some Agile in dev and IT. And maybe, remember, we're in this thing called scope. We're trying to figure out how big is the scope of what we're doing. Maybe that's the only scope they're interested in. Hey, I just want to do a larger scale transition or adoption within dev or IT. Oops, sorry. So the first thing I try to establish with the company is, what are we focused on? Is it all of dev and IT? Or is it just a particular department? Could be really big. Dev IT group, like thousands of people, and it could be, no, we're going to do all 1,000. We're just going to do this one department over here. It could just be a specific product by whatever that means. And some of those products can be pretty large, but it might just be one of many. Or it could just be a specific development value stream. A collection of activities and related systems that go from some user-initiated activity to some final state. Click to cash. Click, all the steps through, got my money. That could be a value stream. So first thing is, what is the unit of focus? Right, we have to establish. So if you're doing a transition, you need to know that. The next slide is trying to illustrate that if you look at the effect of Agile, this is why those other groups have to get in. This is why you define my best dream. Because if you think about it, you got dev saying, we're Agile. See how many of these are familiar to you, maybe within your own company, right? Legal is saying, we need to write contracts to shift risk to the other party. Basically, fixed price, fixed date, fixed scope contracts. The complete opposite of how you would do this in an Agile world. Already binding the development group in an over-constrained way by how contracts are being written. Or HR, we need all these well-defined, legally defensible processes, so we do performance reviews. HR is clearly affected when we adopt Agile. If nothing else, the processes they put in place, how they evaluate people, who they should be hiring, the kinds of people they want to bring in, they're affected. I mean, think about finance. This is why I was happy the CFO showed up in the room, right? How many of you go through annual budgeting? And usually during annual budgeting, at least in the US, this is where the company tries to define the complete portfolio of projects they will work on up to 15 months into the future, assign a dollar value to each of them, and then I will now hold you accountable for how every single dollar gets spent next year, and if you don't spend it the way you said you would 15 months earlier, it's on you. Yeah, that's not exactly the most Agile-like way to handle financing here. So yeah, I want the CFO in the room so we can have a conversation. What about our partners? So big companies have a lot of partners, and we're doing Agile internally, but our partner is happily walking the waterfall path. Now what are we going to do? How do we interact with our partners that are doing that? Marketing. How many of you are in companies where marketing asks you on the first day, tell me exactly what the feature set will be and exactly the day it's going to ship, because I have to get the marketing material ready right now. And you're like, first day of the project, day I have the worst possible knowledge I'm ever going to have. You want to know exactly what we're going to deliver and exactly the date we're going to do it. And at the same time, let me tell you exactly what it's going to cost down to the dollar. Good luck with that, by the way. Oh, and if you're wrong, I'll hold you accountable. So again, I want to engage marketing in a way that we can help them get the information they need in a timely fashion without putting undue burden on us. Right? And you can keep going, right? You have operations that might be releasing according to its own schedule. I mean, how agile are you if you build really great stuff and you have no ability to get it into production? Have you really achieved goals of agility? Not very likely, right? And so on, right? And then sales, pushing more WIP into the system, more work in process, work on more and more stuff, and we're already overloaded on what we're doing. So yeah, I think we need to get some of the other groups engaged in an agile transformation, because if we don't, we're going to have all kinds of major impediments occurring from outside that are making it nearly impossible for us to deliver on the value that the company expects to get from Agile. So, scope can be rather broad. Oh, and what I found interesting is the Scrum Alliance does an annual survey, and a couple years ago, I pulled a couple graphs out of a survey. This was from 2015. Look at the question that was being asked. Outside of IT, which departmental areas run Scrum projects? So how much is Scrum being used outside of IT? Operations or productions, 48%. I can't imagine that surprises anybody. Not with the whole DevOps movement happening. How about this one though? R&D, 46%. Sales and marketing, 26%. So you can start to see that Agile is finding its way into areas outside of Dev and IT. That's good. But, look at the next slide. Another question I asked, is there a tension between the way Scrum teams are run and the way the rest of your organization is managed? If you look at that, 71% basically said yes or to some extent. So we have a conflict, a mismatch, right, in how we're doing it. So a lot of what I have to deal with is helping organizations find a way of smoothing this out so there's not so much conflict among the groups. And I'm going to show you how I do that, which is the next section. We good on this? The key, and the one thing I need all those different groups, all of these groups to agree to is that, the Agile mindset. I honestly don't care whether marketing runs sprints. If they think running sprints in marketing or using a Kanban system in marketing is the right way for marketing to do marketing's work, good by me. Okay. So I don't care about that. What I care about is they have the Agile mindset. And it sounds like pizza's here. So why don't we take a break, let people grab some food, and then if you guys are okay eating while I talk, I'm good with that. So if you want to grab food and bring it back, we'll be good. Okay, welcome back. So we're Agile, right? So we're going to inspect and adapt here. There's about half the material left. We won't have time to cover it all, right? Because, we're scheduled to go till 9, and our host is gracious that if we go a couple minutes over, that's fine. But I'm sure people have things to do tonight or want to go home at least after a long day. Not me, I've been touring the city all day. I was a tourist today. Nice city, thank you. So I'm going to increase my speed a little bit. For any reason, like I'm going like this with my mouth, just say, slow down. The Agile mindset. So I said I wanted people to align on core Agile principles. So first, focus on adapting the mindset, then apply those principles. So I want the finance people to understand core Agile principles. Again, not because they need to run Scrum in finance, but because they need to know how to do things like cost accounting on an Agile project, which at least in the US is radically different than it would be if you're doing a waterfall project. And it has real consequences from tax purposes and things like that. So I need them to align on principles, and I want to avoid what is often called the cargo cult adoption. Let me define what I mean by that. So I'll do this quickly. During World War II, as the war was progressing in the Pacific, the U.S. would set up forward staging where they would drop cargo in for troops that were going through the Pacific. So planes would show up, they drop cargo, they would stage it on the island. Now, the people who lived on the island had never seen airplanes, had never met anybody outside the island before, and quite honestly, it was wonderful. I mean, great stuff fell out of the sky. Food, medicine, equipment, right? And so as the war progressed, the U.S. didn't need those bases anymore, so they left. And so the people that lived there were like, where's all the great stuff that's falling from the sky? So what they decided to do was replicate what they saw. So they made bamboo airplanes. They created radio towers. They cut a coconut in half, put one shell here, the other shell here, because headset, large bamboo pole for an antenna. And they would sit there and go through all the motions, but yet nothing came down from the sky. And in the 1960s, this was labeled cargo cult. Basically, people who go through the motions, do the mechanics without understanding why they're doing it and expecting the same result. And so I see that same thing with Agile adoptions, which you see a cargo cult approach to doing Agile. Meaning, how many times have you encountered a company where someone will say, we do Scrum? What do you mean by that? We do a daily stand-up. What else? We'll do planning. It's like, we do the, so and you got to test them. Why do you do the planning meeting? What's the purpose? What's the purpose of the daily Scrum? Why do you do that? We're doing it though. So we're trying to avoid cargo cult, and this kind of goes through the idea that correlation isn't going to imply causation here. So I'm going to jump past this just for time reasons. My point was that if you start doing Agile without understanding the why underneath the mechanics of what you're doing, you'll be in no position to inspect and adapt, right? Which is what we need to do, which is what the core principles give us. All right. Now, the question came up earlier, what about training, coaching, external coaching? I'll give you my opinion. Remember, I'm an external trainer and coach, so please understand any bias that might be on the slides. I don't think there's a bias, but there might be. I think they're critical. I think getting some form of training and coaching for a company that's going to start a larger scale adoption is critical. Okay, now the question is, who should you involve and when should you involve them? Well, you may recall timeline, right? Time is going this way. Initially, typically before I show up, this is typically where I'll show up, the decision to scale. They've already selected a pilot project. Maybe they have one or more pilot teams. They're going to work against that project. They've probably done some training for these teams. Sometimes I'll go in and I'll do that training. Other times they've already done it, a year ago or something. And they might have even trained some managers. Probably, but not always. Then they decide, okay, now we really need to do this at larger scale. So this is just a replication of the pattern that you're seeing here. So what you start to see is internal stakeholders get trained. Internal stakeholders, senior management, right? Anybody that would be viewed as a stakeholder. The teams, maybe now many teams. So when I go in and I'm training 600 people, obviously that's a lot of teams, right? Typically 70 or so teams. And then this. Usually what I'll find is a need or a desire to train internal coaches, like a train the trainer or train the coaches type program, which I think makes perfect sense. The last thing that a company needs is somebody like me there long term. That's a bad idea. First, it's not cost effective. It just isn't, right? And they need to become reliant on themselves, not on external people. external people to help jumpstart what they're doing makes perfect sense. Why not leverage the knowledge of people who've done this before, but get your own people ready to go? So this is a fairly typical pattern that I'll see. Let's go a little bit further. All right. What about internal versus external trainers? I mean, a lot of companies have internal trainers already. So when would you use one or the other? So I would suggest that, well, at least in my experience, and again, it's going to be a little biased by my sample set, external trainers typically do, right, the initial training. I'm usually brought in, and they may say, we're going to have our training people sit in the class because eventually we'll want them to do the training. Great, right? Have them be in the class. So I think you should leverage that, but eventually you do want to transition to internal trainers. And sometimes that happens. But I just told you before break, a lot of times it doesn't, because I still go back like once a quarter to train new people. Maybe they just like the training I was giving. But some companies will transition it to internal trainers, which I still think is a good idea. And we already talked about train the trainers. Now, take it to coaches. I think it would be a very bad idea to not have an external coach involved in a large transition. And if I was a company looking to bring in an external coach, the first question I would ask that coach is, tell me all the other companies you've done this for already, and give me the names and phone numbers of people at those companies that I can call to find out how it's going right now. And hopefully a year or two after. Again, as I said, that's where you really want to start measuring how it's really going. So yeah, I think you want to leverage the experience of someone who's already done it. And you're going to have internal coaches. So I'll give you an example. 10 years ago, I was helping a company do a large transition. Roughly 500 people. 400 in Mumbai, 100 in New York City. And we set up an internal coaching program with the idea that every new Scrum team that would start up would have internal coach support, but initially the external coaches did the coaching and an internal coach acted in more of a mentee role, like mentor, mentee. So they were being mentored while the external coach was actually doing the coaching. And then what they did is they reversed it. I think that's what the next slide, yeah. This is how we did it. We set up the internal program. So we gave them training, as we said earlier. The next thing we did is the external coaches worked with each of the teams that was doing the transitioning. Internal coaches acted as these apprentices to the external coaches. And then what we did is we had the internal coaches switch over and become the primary coaches to the team, and the external coaches moved into an observation mode. They would watch, right? And they would periodically offer suggestions on how the internal coach might do things differently. And then eventually, the internal coaches acted as the mentors to the next wave, and all the external coaches left. There was 3 of us at the time. I was the enterprise coach. There was 2 other coaches that came in to be on the ground. And it took about a year, but after a year, we were out. Not a year full time. Once a month going out, stuff like that. And then others went in. So an example of how you might do it, please. So how do you incentivize companies to make internal coaches worth their time? So the easiest way for me to convince them is on pure economics. Look at the cost of what you're paying me. Look at what the cost it would be to have an internal coach. And if you have good internal coaches, the economics will strongly favor having them versus bringing in outside coaches. So I can make a money argument to them, and that's usually all I need for senior managers, is to make a sound financial argument. The real problem isn't there. In my experience is this. See if this is true in your company. There is no HR ladder for coaching. There's a technical ladder, there's a management ladder, but where do the coaches reside? Are they on the technical ladder or are they over here? And that gets a little confusing, and then you have people like, why would I want that job? because where do I go? How do I move up? Now, this is more recent. I mean, 10 years ago, that's the way it is, right? You know, just companies would choose, are you technical or are you business? I'm seeing more companies today actually institute a coaching type ladder. I saw one the other day that was, I don't remember the exact adjective. It might have been apprentice Scrum Master, then Scrum Master, then Senior Scrum Master, and then they had a role called Agile Coach, and then there was one above that. Actually, I don't think they had the Senior. They probably should have. Executive Agile Coach. But there probably should have been a Senior between Agile Coach and Executive Agile Coach. And this was a formal ladder with HR titles, pay bands that went with it and everything. My guess is long term, more companies will do that. So it becomes clear and motivating to the people internally. So that's the whole coaching part of it all. And then, as I say, external coaches get weaned out. Now, one of the things you want to avoid doing as an external coach is this. See if this conversation sounds familiar. So the business, what do you think about X? X is really important. Right? That's what she's saying back. How should we proceed with X? Well, there are 3 ways to proceed with X. Which would you like to do? I'll support anything you want to do. I don't know. That's why I'm paying you. So, as I said earlier, I don't try to give them solutions to their problems, but if I get asked a pointed question like, we need to decide how to move forward, I'm going to engage with them and say, here's how I've seen other companies do it. I think personally this approach would work well here, but I want to make sure you're aware that there's at least 2 other approaches. Let's have a conversation. But they know that I have a preference for one of them based on my own experience. That's what they're paying me for, just to say, I'll do whatever you want, is really not a very satisfying response to a business person. Like, I hired you, right? Don't leave me hanging. So don't do that. Okay, restructuring teams for flow. This is every company that I visit. Let me see if I can motivate this. Component teams, is this term familiar? Let's make sure we agree on it. Component teams work on reusable pieces of technology. They don't build end customer valuable assets. They build a piece of technology that other teams can use to build features. Right? So that's a component team. A feature team is exactly what you think it is. The items in that backlog are things of recognizable value to customers. And in a feature team, I just pull a feature off. I give it to a team. They have all the skills necessary to get the feature done. End of the sprint, feature is done, go to production. So you got component teams, you got feature teams. 3 or 4 times a year, I go into companies and I do that. That's a value stream map. I did one 2 months ago for this bank I'm working with. Every single time, so basically what we're doing here is we're laying out how the work is flowing from when somebody has an idea to as it goes through the entire process until it's in production. What are all the teams, all the activities that are involved, paying particular attention to where the work is sitting idle and how long it's sitting idle. Every time I've done this, the work is sitting idle 90% of the time or more. That was supposed to freak you out. All right, let me try again. A customer asks you for a feature. You say, yes, we'll do it. Take a stopwatch out of your pocket. Customer asks, you say, yes. Click. Time is running. From the customer's point of view, click just happened. You not get to click the stopwatch again until you deliver the feature. Click. What I just said was, from click to click, 90% of the time, nothing is happening. The work is sitting idle. Say again? 9-0. Nothing is happening. Now you have to imagine how surprised I am when I go into a company like that, before we do this exercise, senior management will say this: I really hope that when you're done with my teams, they'll be 10% more efficient using Scrum. That's their metric for success. I'm like, really? That's the problem you want me to help you solve? Do the math. 90% of the time the work isn't moving, which means 10% of the time the teams are doing value-adding work. If you squeezed a 10% improvement out of the 10% of the time they're doing value-adding work, you'd get precisely 1% improvement. If we squeeze 10% of the waste out of how the work was flowing across those teams, you'd immediately get a 9% return. They're watching the wrong thing in these companies. They have this problem principally because of utilization and how they're building up queues of work all over. So we map it out so that people can sit there and go, no, it can't be that bad. I'm like, that's your model. I just helped you draw it. Right. And then you take it further and you say, why is this happening? Because you have every team basically trying to communicate with every other team, and you set up this huge network of dependencies, right? And then what you end up having is all these backlogs on these teams that are filling up with work being requested from all these other teams, and you have a prioritization problem because someone's got to figure out in what order to do that stuff. And then the way they figure it out screams the loudest, right in their face. A policy I call noisiest person first. Whoever yells at you the loudest, just do their work to shut them up. It's probably a bad scheduling algorithm. Right. And then you end up with stuff like this. One team says, we're ready. Another team says, we're ready. And then finally, they say they're ready. And the whole thing's blocked because I need all three teams to be ready to get anything done. As I said, this gets really bad. All this inventory is building up all over product development. And as I just told you, companies that do this, is probably sitting idle 90% of the time, which is every large company that I have visited. Every one of them. So yeah, we have to restructure the teams. Now the problem earlier was around what? So we had that part of the discussion already. Right? How are we going to restructure them? What I'm looking for is what I call fast, flexible, and economically sensible flow. You can do it simple, fast, flexible flow. I want to move the work quickly, new ideas, bug fixes, across the collection of teams we put in place to get the job done. And I want to do it quickly, right? Click to click on the stopwatch. So in any large adoption, transition, transformation, you will be restructuring teams. It's a guarantee. Because every company has so heavily relied on component teams at the expense of feature teams that the result of their current structure is work will be blocked, likely up to about 90% of the time. How in the world will you be successful if you don't touch the team structure? And by the way, most companies have no appetite at all for another corporate reorganization that involves teams. This is one of the first really big problems I'll run into. We just restructured all those teams last year. We don't want to do that again. Then we do the map up on the wall and look at how bad things are going. So this was partly the question that came up earlier, the resistance to change. The one way I describe it is protection of the fiefdoms. Everybody's got their own little kingdom, and they want to protect that, and nobody wants to make a change in what they're doing, right? And they don't believe, right? There's this belief, right, that if we go to feature teams, our technical debt will go up because multiple people will be making changes to the same asset versus a single team making the changes, and therefore we're more likely to accrue technical debt. So there's some real hurdles that you have to clear in order to get this passed, but you have to work on this or you won't be successful. Here's an example of a company I did this with 3 years ago. Right? Geo here is geography. It's a global organization. They have teams across multiple geographies. This is showing you how many application teams are in each geography. The other teams you see are component teams that are shared across all the geographies. It is a mess to get anything done. Like, for example, one of these teams in here is the style sheet team. So, and now imagine in any geography, if you need to make a change that involves style sheets for your website, you have to create an item for the style sheet team's backlog, put it in there, and you have no idea in the world when you'll ever see this item get done, because you're not the only one asking. All the other teams over here are also asking for style sheet changes. You have no clue when it's going to happen. They're trying to do planning events at a geography level, and you got the style sheet product owner going, you need to be, they say to them, you need to be able to commit to giving me this sprint. It's like, I have no clue in the world if I can give that to you. So the first reaction was, well, we should start to change all these teams over. So now I'm going to show you the reality of it. Most of the times you can't. I just told you you have to do this. I wasn't trying to imply you had to do it on day one. Because in big companies, you won't pull that off. Right? Think of the reason. The current teams are responsible for getting the current products out the door right now. All those teams on the previous slide are trying to get this year's products out the door. Doing a massive team restructuring could put current products in jeopardy. So you're not going to convince the president of the division to do this, not immediately, right? It's risky to make large team changes, and probably the most important is that, great, let's change all the teams. How? What's the right structure? On the first day, you think that's the day you have the perfect knowledge of exactly what your team structure should be? So even people are like, we want to do this, we have to do this. I'm like, great, tell me what the team structure is going to look like. And they'll look at me and go, that's your job, tell us. I'm like, I got no clue. I have an idea of what the pattern ought to look like, but if you're asking me inside that blue box for fast, flexible flow, what your teams ought to look like, we're going to have to figure that out, and it's not going to happen day one. So you have to do it, and it won't be easy. That's why I think when you asked earlier, have I seen some of these transitions not be successful? Because of this. Last piece, please. So let's agree when it comes to distributed teams, the problem is time zones. It's not physical distribution. I could have other teams located here in Europe. We're roughly in the same time zone. Maybe we're off by an hour or so. Now I'll put teams, let's see. My Fitbit friends have team members in San Francisco. 10 hours. Sometimes 11. 10 right now, right? So 10 hours. There's really nothing good about that. No, I mean, you don't overlap really any hours in the day unless somebody is shifting hours to do it. You can still be agile, but you're going to be less agile. Sorry, right? But somebody made a decision that they wanted to have people 10 time zones apart. If I could choose differently, I wouldn't have done that. But in a lot of companies, that's not a choice. Most large organizations that I encounter have distributed teams. That's like a guarantee. So you need to be able to make this work with distributed teams, or you'll have no chance at all. Usually the technique most organizations use is called share the pain. Don't always have one side be inconvenienced. So you can't always do your daily scrum so that it's convenient for the people in San Francisco, not so convenient here. So maybe we do it a couple sprints where, yeah, it's morning over there and it's early evening here, then reverse it. Do it when it's comfortable in the morning here and it's in the evening over there. Share the pain. Let's handle the last piece, and we'll call it a night. Measure. Everybody wants to measure how well is our transition going. Well, some of the costs of doing a transition are fairly easy to quantify. For example, what's the cost of training? I can tell you that. Right? You tell me how many people you want to train over what period of time. A couple other minor factors, I can say this is exactly what it'll cost you to train your people. So that's a number we can probably get. And same with coaching. We could define how much external coaching people needed, and there you go. And you probably could even calculate the cost of retooling. Maybe you need to bring in new tools, like bring in Jira or Rally or version 1. You get a quote from them, I'll tell you exactly what your licenses are going to cost. So these are easily quantifiable. Other things, not so much. What's the cost of that restructuring we just talked about? I don't really know how to put a number on that. Right? The disruption cost, right? The fact that people feel uncomfortable and they're less productive when this is happening. So I don't know that you will quantify, which again is why I find it funny when those requests for proposals come in and they say, we need to know the cost of doing this. I'm like, well, I can certainly tell you some of the cost, but a lot of it, arguably the most interesting ones, I can't. So right, that's a good way of putting it. So let's say you don't do the this transition. What's that cost going to be to you? How great are things going today? Right. We can do a little bit better. More compelling. Which of those two statements? Which one do you like better? You like the first or who likes the first one? Okay, let's make sure you're still voting. Who likes the second one? Okay, it's one to see. The first one is an output measure. The second one is an outcome measure. They're very different, right? A company that increases, there are a lot of companies that try to communicate their success by changes in velocity. I would suggest that if you go online tonight and pull up case studies that you can find on the internet, almost always they'll communicate their results in terms of velocity. So let's see how that works out. We've increased velocity 400%. Originally, the stuff we produced was crap. Now we produce crap 400% faster. I'm not really sure we achieved our goal on that one. All right. Just saying you go faster doesn't mean anything unless you can tie it to an outcome. I would far prefer to have the second one. That's measurable, right? 40% increase, right, in share price. That's quantifiable in real units of money. Here's the point. Output measures measure what we produce. The king of all output measures is clearly velocity. The amount of work produced per unit of time, right? But that's not the only thing. Cycle time, throughput, utilization, number of widgets created. That'd be McDonald's. Number of hamburgers served. 10 billion served. How many of your customers are happy about that, though? Right? You might have served a whole lot, but I don't know that anybody's happy about the result. Whereas outcome is what difference do we make? I would say that if it were me, I'd be measuring my adoption, transition, transformation based on outcome change. That's the only thing that should matter here. In doing that, Net Promoter Score is an outcome measure. Profitability, delighted customers. If your foundation, number of, percentage reduction in malaria infections. That's outcome. Here's what a Gates output measure would be. Number of malaria vaccines delivered to the port in Africa, where they all went bad waiting to be delivered to the people who needed them. Great, you delivered 1 million vaccines that went to nobody. So here's an output measure that shows no value at all. That would show value. So what we want is to be able to come up with the right kind of measures. All right. So I've already given you that. That was if you open it by 4%. Here's some data. This is from the version 1 study. So they do their annual state of the Agile market. The way that people measure success of their Agile adoptions. This is people who self-report on how they measure success. On-time delivery, quality, customer satisfaction, business value. A lot of these up front are output. Look at the next one. There's the king, right? Velocity, 57%. Iteration burn down, your sprint burn down chart is how they're measuring, right? Day to day. Okay, great. But again, I don't know that that communicates to having increased shareholder value or anything like that. So my point is, the marketplace as a whole, the industry as a whole, is focused on the wrong thing, principally on output not on outcome. So how do we change that? This is just an example. Don't worry about too much of the details. Years ago, Mike Cohn and I started an initiative called Comparative Agility. It's a survey instrument. You go online, you take a survey, and it would tell you how agile your team is. We're not involved in it anymore. We handed it off to some other guys to run with it. But this is an output report from Comparative Agility. You answer all the questions, and it gives you a report. This one's not so good, right? These are negative bars. Those are the number of standard deviations from the norm that this team is achieving, which kind of sucks, right, when you look at that. But here's the point. Most of those are output measures. So what you could do using this assessment is you could assess your team today, 6 months into your adoption, assess your team again, and compare those teams with themselves 6 months earlier and say, how are they doing? And you can say, that's really cool. And it is really cool, by the way. Really telling you outcome. Here's the key. And it's really the last slide. You have to be able to map the output measures to outcome measures. You need to know the transformation of an output measure to an outcome. So if you can show me why an improvement in velocity leads to a positive change in an outcome measure, I'm all about seeing a greater velocity change, because I can track that to how it meaningfully affects an outcome measure. So the answer to the question, how do you measure your transition? First thing I do when I go to a company is I say, how do you measure outcome today? They have to have some way, right? I mean, every company has some way of measuring outcome. Right? How do you measure it today? And then you ask, of course, the next question. What are those baseline numbers? Right? I mean, you're about to do a change, right? You need to know the baseline numbers so you can do a comparison at some point in the future. And most of the time they'll have it. Sometimes maybe they have to go collect some data just to make sure. Then we can start looking at, are there any kind of output measures, and can we get a sensitivity analysis to determine that a change on an output measure affects outcome? So there are no standard set of metrics is the point. Every company has to have its own outcome measures, and then we look at how we can collect data that can show, hopefully as a leading indicator, that we're doing things that will positively affect outcome. So I know that was a lot. And I'm also probably out of time. Please. Yeah, that's actually a really difficult question, right? Because the economy, first of all, congratulations on getting a lot of outsourcing work, right? Yeah, you're competing with a lot of countries for it, and you're winning, so that sounds pretty good to me. Yeah, you already know that I'm not a project fan, and I would like to move away from the project idea, but chances are, I mean, the long-term strategy is that companies outsource a long-lived product for your organization to work on. So that becomes the proper unit of focus rather than small one-off projects that they're doing. That would be the preferred way of doing it, and now you're focused on something that lives for more than the duration of a single project. I mean, I hope it's clear that products are long-lived, projects are fleeting. They come and they go. A product might live 10, 20 years. You could have hundreds of projects that you do against a product like that. I'd rather align long-lived teams with long-lived products. So I try to move my company towards contracts that allowed for product-based focus. How easy that's going to be, I can't really say. But boy, that's an interesting question. Please. Yes. Yeah. So I'm trying to give you a good example of this. Some of the obvious first of all, what I'm looking for, if I can, are leading indicators. by measuring this today, I can predict an outcome that's going to happen versus a lagging indicator, which is it's already happened and I just was able to measure that it happened. The leading indicators are much more helpful to me. Lagging, it's already taken, I've already done the work, so there's no chance to fix that per se. What's a good example? I mean, the one I want to do it with is velocity, but I need to have enough data to show that teams going faster actually are moving a needle on one of those gauges in a positive way. So the way I would go about collecting that is baseline today of a measure like profitability. Because you would think that the benefit of going faster is quick time to market. I mean, that's the obvious assumption, right? That if our velocity improves, we can get more features into the marketplace faster. And that may be true, but again, if they're all crap, it doesn't mean it's helping you. In fact, it might actually accelerate hurting you. So I need to know what my baseline profitability looks like, and then at some point in the future, look at the change in velocity. And the difficulty is a lot of variables might have changed, and it might not have just been velocity. So your goal, of course, is to run a controlled experiment, which most companies will never do, right? So I'm hoping that you have some analytical people, right, at your company that can help you extract meaningful correlations from things like, because you'll know if velocity improved or not, right? That's easy to track. Whether it went up or down, you'll know that. It's being able to tie it back through this. That'll be more difficult. But I would say most companies go after velocity for that. Please. So which variable are we talking about? Because it probably differs. I'm hoping that, I really hope that outcome measures do not dip initially. If they do in any significant way, I bet senior management will start to lose their appetite for the transition. If share price starts going down and they think they can attribute that to bringing Agile in, your Agile effort won't live long. All right, so I like velocity to actually go down initially. A lot of change is happening, right, within the team. You have to absorb the change, and it's probably going to go down before it goes to a new plateau, right? I expect that, but I would hope that outcome measures aren't dipping. I'd like to see immediate changes to outcome measures, and I think in a lot of companies you could get it. I just said 90% of the time the work isn't moving. I'm pretty comfortable I can make a dramatic impact if they'll let me start the process of doing team transitions. I'm pretty comfortable about that, and I'm pretty comfortable to affect outcome measures. I just need to be able to show them it's doing that in a way that they'll believe. Other comments or questions about any? Otherwise, we'll call it a night. Please. So my guess is in most companies that still exists, that I'm a member of a development team. Very likely I do not report to the Scrum Master. I do report to a functional manager somewhere within the organization. So QA person, I probably, in most organizations, report to a QA manager. UX person probably reports to a UX manager. And if there's a problem with me, it will escalate out of the Scrum team and go to my manager, who then will probably have a very serious conversation with me. And if the problem were to continue, it will probably escalate to HR. I heard them say it. The team initially, right? Now, the Scrum Master, since it's a self-organizing team, I expect if I'm having a problem, I refuse to show up for daily Scrum meetings. I don't know why you people go to that. That's 15 minutes of my life I'll never get back. You can go. I'm not going. Well, that's a problem, right? Because it's a team-based activity and I'm not participating. I would expect team members to talk to me first about why me being there is important. If that didn't work, maybe Scrum Master, but eventually my manager. Please. Mm. No, it's an interesting problem, right? Yeah, and so as a team, I think we should work through that. Maybe the whole team has to go outside for a smoke break. Please. So at scale, the product owner role will scale hierarchically. I mean, one of the largest Scrum efforts I ever worked on was with Nokia. We had 2,500 people on one project. First observation, don't ever do that. No, I mean, it's really like hard to coordinate 2,500 people, right? So you have to put in some structure to do that. And conceptually, there was one product, so arguably there was only one product owner. But if your average team size is 10 or less, that's 250 teams or more, and it's simply not practical for one person to be the product owner for 250 teams. Might be the product owner for you. Oh, certainly less than a handful, right? I mean, if anybody ever said, I'm the product owner for 9 teams, I'm like, wow, do you walk on water also? I'm just curious how you do that, right? But I mean, no, at the end of the day, at Nokia, we had 5 levels of product backlogs, if you're curious how we address that. I didn't say 5 product backlogs. I said 5 levels of product backlog. We're trying to coordinate 2,500 people, right? There's a lot that goes in that. So again, don't do that, right? But there are bigger projects, right? What if you have 100 people? What if the work really just requires 100 people? Well, that could be 10 or more teams. Conceptually, you have a single product owner if there's one product, the chief product owner, if you'd like, right? But chances are there's going to be people that are filling product owner-like roles that are below the chief product owner, right? Because they'll have to be there more at a team-based level. So you'll see the roles start to scale hierarchically. But conceptually, one product backlog, one product owner. That's my starting point. That's my starting point at Nokia. I'll back off from that when I have to be practical. But my starting point is one product backlog, one product owner. Please. Yep. No, this is the vocabulary problem. They are typically based on the granularity. I mean, you use like, let me choose an obvious example. Microsoft Office. So let's say we're Microsoft, we're going to build Office. Well, the product is Microsoft Office. Not technically true. I do training for Microsoft. I learned that you can actually go to their website and buy an individual app, but almost nobody does that, right? They buy Office. So for all practical purposes, Office is the product. So you'd expect there to be an Office product owner. But you probably also expect that there's a Word product owner, Excel product owner, and so on. And then you probably have many teams that work on Word. Microsoft said they had 3,500 people that worked on Office. So you'd have multiple teams for Word and Excel, and they probably have some kind of product ownership at that level as well. What's in the backlog? Well, at the Office level, I bet they're epics. The next version will work in the cloud. I mean, that kind of level. Or we really want want to enter the Vietnamese market, so we need to be able to spell check Vietnamese, or you can't sell in the local market. Cool. If I went to the office product owner and said, hey, that sounds really interesting. Tell me more about spell checking Vietnamese. I bet that guy says, I don't know anything about that. Go talk to the spell checker product owner. Because in his backlog down here, he's got detailed stories dealing with spell checking. And at the office, the Word or Excel level, yet another higher level granularity, but smaller than, right, the office level. So it's definitely a granularity issue. Absolutely. Please. Ultimately, yes. In Agile, in Scrum, there is only one product owner for the backlog, for the product. And that person has ultimate authority. So the office product owner is the single wringable neck. If the next version of Office is a bad product, the CEO of Microsoft, Satya, is going to come over and go for that guy. He's not going after the spell checker guy. He will go after the Office product owner guy. At least I assume he would. Please. So, no, that's fair. That's a fair question. If it were me, I would have everybody would get paid a base salary and would have an incentive part of their compensation, a bonus opportunity. I would have a majority of that bonus based on team performance and a small subset based on individual performance. So hence your question is valid, right? Because even if I did a 70-30 split, 70% team, 30% individual, I still have to be able to evaluate individuals on the 30%. The good news is that managers, if you're, sorry, I don't want to offend anybody, but good managers know exactly how their people are doing. They don't need to read any reports or look at anything else. They know because they're walking around, they're keeping their eyes on what's going on, they're talking to their people. And if they need input, they can do a 360. They can talk to the team members, they can talk to the Scrum Master. So I think they have many ways of getting that. I've seen one organization where they had the other team members determine what the bonus would be for an individual. Seemed remarkably fair. She was awesome. If she didn't do what she did, we probably would have failed, right? She should get a much larger bonus than anybody else. Cool. They're in a good position to know. That's an example, though. But yeah, you do need to, managers have to have an input source for that, whatever percentage is. So I don't know if that directly answers it with a specific go measure, but I think good managers have that information already. Follow-ups to that or anything else before they ask us to leave? I see your hand up in the back. Yeah. Retraining. Yeah, retraining. That actually is more common than I would like. I've had to go into some, I wouldn't say a lot, but some companies where I was there to help resurrect, to bring back to life something that was dying already for whatever reasons, right? Could have been a change in senior management. Just could have been, they just weren't doing it very well. And so they weren't getting the results. And so almost always it's a retraining to start with. Please. So here's a suggestion. I think it would be best to not think about transformations in a binary sense of successful or failing, because that's too broad brushstrokes. You need to be a bit more fine-grained than that. So to me, it's really all about degrees, right? Because people say Agile failed. Now, if I wanted to be a hardcore Agilist, I go, no, Agile didn't fail. Your implementation of it wasn't successful, right? But I'm not sure Agile failed. So I almost never use the word successful or failure. I like to talk about what's working and what isn't working and what we could do better about it. But yeah, they're certainly going down. right? They're not going the right direction on those, hey, can you help us get back on track kind of clients. But that's not the majority. The majority are like, hey, we've been doing this for a little bit. We did our pilot. It's looking pretty good. We want to do this on a broader scale. We want to get the business involved. How do we do that? That's more what I see these days. Nothing else? All right, we have time for like one more, or are we out of time? One more, okay. We're going to have to negotiate. You two are... Yes.
Thank you so much, Ken.